What this is a seminar that is with faculty and students from the United States, all in some level are not focusing on peace and conflict issues. And one of the things that is important for me in starting this off is getting kind of the macro look of what everybody is facing, kind of at we'll say the 50,000 feet, right? We often are thinking about things in our own particular communities, but one of the things that the Institute of Economics and Peace has done is through the Global Peace Index and other things have been able to kind of pull it back a little bit and show us what the world looks like, right? And what the world looks like, I think it's really important as educators because we are bringing students into our classroom. The students in our classroom are wanting to learn about the rest of the world. And often we are sharing with them maybe the war narrative rather than the peace narrative sometime, right? So IEP has done some really important work in that area. So that's why I like to start it off by you talking about what is the latest and what's going on there. So just to say a little bit about you, you have an economics degree in peace and justice from Pace University in New York, and you were a Jeanette Watson Fellow with internships in Greece and Australia. You were from Manila, and you were born and raised, or at least raised in the LA area, and you currently live in Brooklyn. And remind me, what is your position at the Institute of Economics? You're like the outreach person, is that the job that
Yes.
you have? Okay. All right, I'm going to then turn it over to you. We are going to go until 1 o'clock our time. If you take questions and answers within that, that's fine, because I will monitor. If not, then from 1 to 1:15, we'll take questions. You should be able to share everything on your screen. Folks, if you have questions as Jessica is going through, unless Jessica wants to take them in real time, then you just put them in the chat and send them to her, okay? Otherwise, and you can raise your hand too, because I'll be monitoring that if you'd rather do that. Let's kind of save that to the end so that we have time to do that, okay? All right, Jessica, it's all yours. Thank you for being here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, yes, so as David mentioned, hi everyone, my name is Jessica. I'm the Outreach and Development Officer at the Institute for Economics and Peace, calling in to you from our office in Manhattan. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, David kind of mentioned that at IEP, we do specialize in global indices, and IEP is an independent nonprofit think tank, and we're dedicated to really building a greater awareness of the key drivers of peace, as well as the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. Kind of what we're known for in this field is that we are the people who try to quantify peace and kind of show it to you in a very economic way using numbers and statistics and data visualization. So we do specialize in delivering global indices such as the Global Peace Index. We also produce the Global Terrorism Index, as well as country level reports such as the Mexico Peace Index and the Germany Peace Index. And so last year at the Community College Peace Building Seminar, I was lucky enough to present the findings of the 2020 Global Peace Index. And I will touch on the 2021 GPI today. But what I really wanted to focus on in today's presentation is another area of focus that we have in our research, which is our positive peace research. And although we are primarily a research institution, IEP has a distinct interest in turning that research into tools and frameworks that can be used for peace education and community action. And so since I'm kind of sharing this space with educators and students, part of the session today, I want to talk about how we can utilize, economic research and kind of present it in a way that can be a really accessible learning tool. So I want to start by talking about the concept of negative peace and positive peace. I know many of you are very familiar. I know when I took my first peace studies class, this is like the first thing, one of the first concepts you learn. And at IE, we define negative peace as the absence of violence or fear of violence. But we also recognize that simply having an absence of conflict is not enough. And you really need an understanding of the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. And so really that's what peace building is all about, not only addressing the drivers of conflict, but also finding ways to build resilience. And we kind of make the analogy that, when you get sick, you want to figure out what caused you to be sick. Was it an underlying symptom? Is this genetic? And if you're like me, you also want to figure out what can I do so I don't get sick again? And so I figure out what lifestyle changes I need to make, if I should take some vitamins, supplements, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'd like to think of peace building as a similar process of analysis, looking at both the causes of conflict as well as the factors that sustain or build resilience. And so it's actually this, principle philosophy that drives a majority of our research here at IEP. So if you look at our two core reports, the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index, the Global Peace Index is actually rooted in that definition of negative peace, the factors that are related to the absence of violence or the fear of violence. And Positive Peace Index, obviously being driven by that definition of positive peace. So hopefully this is kind of helpful as I kind of introduce you to these two core reports in our research portfolio. And so let me go ahead and show you the findings of the 2021 Global Peace Index, and then we can kind of delve further into this concept and then move on into thinking about positive peace. So if you were in last year's session, you'll know that the GPI is an annual report. So we publish it every year in June. And the GPI looks at 163 countries and ranks them by their levels of peacefulness using 23 indicators, as I mentioned, based on that definition of negative peace. So those indicators are divided into three categories. So the first is ongoing domestic and international conflict, where we track active conflicts as well as death from conflicts. The second measures levels of societal safety and security, which includes things like homicide, deaths from terrorism, and levels of refugees and IDPs. And lastly, our third category are measures of militarization, which include military expenditure, weapons imports and exports, as well as access to small arms. So I have a question for the group that I'd love to kind of monitor in the chat box. So based on these indicators, which countries do you think would perform best on the Global Peace Index? As in, which do you think are the most peaceful countries that could be ranked by the GPI? So go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll see what some of you all come up with. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the countries that would rank top 10 on the Global Peace Index. New Zealand, Iceland, Costa Rica, interesting, Denmark. Some of you might have already read the Global Peace Index, so you might already know the answers. Finland. Yeah, these are really good answers. So the next slide, I'll show you which ones ranked top 10 as according to the 2021 Global Peace Index. So Iceland, as David mentioned, is number one and has been the most peaceful country as listed on the GPI since the inception of the index. And so the little arrows actually next to the name of the country indicate they're placed in last year's GPI. So if you see New Zealand, which I know was mentioned in the chat, That little arrow means that it was number 3 in the 2020 Global Peace Index, and this year is number 2. But I'll note that when it comes to the most peaceful countries, what we're really tracking are very, very small, very minute changes. What these countries have in common is that all of them have little to no levels of international conflict. So the scores are ultimately very, very close together. But when you look at the other side of the spectrum, the least peaceful countries as ranked on the Global Peace Index, we see that Afghanistan remained the same as to last year in that it was the least peaceful country. And then looking again at those arrows, so we see that Yemen unfortunately deteriorated quite a bit and ranked 3 places lower. And so you can kind of understand those changes as they happen year to year. But in terms of longer trends, before I jump into that, so here you can see it on kind of a larger map, looking at which regions specifically rank on the Global Peace Index and how they might compare to kind of neighboring countries. And as I mentioned, kind of long-term trends. So another thing that our research has kind of found is that since 2008, which is the inception of the index, we've found that the world has gotten less peaceful by about 2%, which considering, the 23 indicators that we use to kind of calculate the GPI is a considerable amount. And although we see that, more countries are becoming more peaceful, those 86 countries are becoming more peaceful, what we found is that the level of conflict in those 75 countries that are becoming less peaceful, their level of conflict is so intense, is that it's bringing the overall level of global peacefulness down. So this chart here builds on that last finding and shows an interesting phenomenon in what we call at IEP a peace gap. So countries that are high in peace continue to increase in peacefulness, whereas countries that are low in peace continue to decline rapidly. So this not only reflects the fact that conflict is actually becoming more intense, but that also that these countries are finding themselves kind of stuck in that cycle of conflict or violence trap. And so at IEP, we like to make the point that it's much easier to destroy peace than it is to build peace, hence this disparity. So in the Global Peace Index, another kind of section of the report is the economic cost of violence. So I personally find this aspect of our research quite powerful and a really great way to kind of ground these findings and really conceptualize the impacts that conflict has globally. So in 2020, the total cost of conflict was about $14.96 trillion. That is equivalent to about 11.6% of the total world GDP, or about $1,900 per person. And we put this into perspective by saying that if the world decreased its violence by 10%, then we would have nearly $1.5 trillion that could be directed to other activities like healthcare, education, or addressing climate change. And so this 10% reduction is actually equivalent to the economies of Switzerland, Denmark, and Ireland combined. And so last year, we actually released a briefing focusing specifically on the conflict out of Afghanistan. And this is where I kind of see the importance of this calculation that we do coming to light. So the total US federal expenditure for the conflict in Afghanistan was about $2.3 trillion. But when we ran it through our calculations, we saw that that's the equivalent of about $50,000 for each Afghan living in the country, which is about 100 times the average of an Afghan's yearly income. So again, I think, by understanding the cost of conflict is a really valuable way to kind of ground its impact, more so than, levels of violence or levels of, deaths from conflict. Just another kind of perspective in terms of understanding that global impact, so to speak. So I'd be happy to take any questions about the Global Peace Index specifically towards the end of the presentation, but let me kind of transition into the second part of our research that I'd like to introduce to you, and that is our Positive Peace Index. So as I mentioned before, these two reports are very rooted in those definitions of negative and positive peace. And so when it comes to the GPI being rooted in negative peace, looking at the causes of conflict, looking at indicators related to terrorism, deaths from conflict, and the cost of violence, thinking about building resilience and kind of not so much combating, but thinking of ways to build strength in terms of addressing conflict. That's kind of one of the reasons why we thought it was necessary to produce a positive peace index. And essentially, when we kind of address, an index like this, we ask ourselves the question, what are the characteristics of the most peaceful societies? So again, in kind of audience interaction, I'm going to turn that question over to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What are the characteristics you think the most peaceful societies have? Feel free to put it in the chat. Carolyn said economic stability. That's great. Low income, low disparities in income and wealth. Great. Public health. High education levels for women. Excellent, excellent. Anyone want to add a couple more? Services for seniors. Wow, that's really great. A de-emphasis on military. Awesome. Well, these are really amazing answers. And when you think of these properties, as a research institution, we say yes, but how do we quantify it? What kind of data is available in order to actually, calculate and compare and correlate, these properties? So, when the Positive Peace Index was created, we looked at, which data sets were available, and not only which data sets were available, but which ones were globally comparable. How can we kind of define these properties for 163 countries? So what was created is what we call the 8 pillars of positive peace, essentially describing the 8 characteristics that the most peaceful societies have. And so through the data sets, we were able to kind of combine categorize them into 8, saying that the most peaceful societies have a well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, whether they be neighboring countries or within their own country, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and a sound business environment. We also found that countries with these high levels of positive peace, with levels that perform well in these 8 categories, have other properties such as higher per capita income, more resilience to shocks such as natural disasters or say COVID-19, better environmental outcomes, higher measures of well-being, and better performance on the SDGs. So results from our Positive Peace Index show that for every 1 index point of improvement in the Positive Peace Index, that's associated with a 10-fold rise in GDP. Countries with high positive peace achieved unemployment rates of under 7% in 2020, compared to rates of up to 23% in low positive peace countries during the pandemic. Growth in business activity was 2 times higher in countries where positive peace improved compared to where they've been deteriorating. Net foreign investment inflows as a percentage of GDP are more than twice as high, twice as big in high peace countries than in low peace ones. And so some other quick quantitative findings: in countries with high positive peace, we see that GDP growth is 33% higher. Corporate profits are 27% higher. International trade is 30% higher. And capital investment is 32% higher. It also goes to show that peace is highly intertwined with, the private sector and other sectors that we might not necessarily think would be involved with peace building. But really, we use that point just as a point to show that peace can be a powerful metric, not only in understanding conflict, but also, predicting economic and investment performance as well. Peace being very interlinked with industries that we might not think are related to peace. And so in addition to studying these factors from a kind of quantitative, very economics driven perspective, though these findings may seem very linear, we found that, the system of positive peace very much works, within a system. So these pillars, though different, correlate deeply with one another. Therefore, an improvement in one pillar would likely affect another. So as an example, an improvement in a well-functioning government would very much likely have ripple effects in high levels of human capital, in acceptance of the rights of others, and vice versa. So, when presenting these pillars, we try to emphasize that, one, the pillars work systemically. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's much easier to, kind of destroy peace than it is to build peace. So we try to make a point that positive peace is very slow moving. It takes time, as it's more than just ceasing conflict or ending violence. Positive peace is a very slow moving process that involves changing cultural attitudes and existing structures. Positive peace is also self-reinforcing in that, as I mentioned, improvements in these aspects are likely to create not only a ripple effect on one another, but a ripple effect in overall growth. And lastly, and in my opinion, most importantly, positive peace is contextual. These definitions of the pillars could mean one thing for one society and something completely different in another. A well-functioning government means something in our country, but could mean something completely different, in the global South or in another country, as ranked on the Positive Peace Index. So in order to kind of engage with this positive peace framework and kind of tune into this understanding, I think cultural context is also very, very important. So in terms of looking at things you can kind of take away from this presentation, from a research perspective, we find the 8 pillars as a really great way to kind of introduce the concept of peace, supported by, not only quantitative data, the 8 pillars can be something that is really accessible to a learner in terms of understanding peace and its different aspects. So the next part of my presentation, I just wanted to end by sharing some tools and some resources that IEP has available for those of you who might be interested. So just very quickly, IEP, in order to kind of teach the positive peace pillars and kind of engage with different kinds of groups and networks, we do have workshops available and work with different kind of community groups. But another resource that I wanted to share with you is our online Positive Peace Academy. So this is a free online course that gives an introduction to peace using our research products such as the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index. So it has 5 modules and it's a self-paced course that kind of includes quizzes and videos. And those of you who complete the course are able to get a certificate at the end. And then lastly, in the spirit of the free flow of information pillar, we do make all of our research available for free on our website, Vision of Humanity. So you're able to read all of our reports, the Global Peace Index, the Positive Peace Index, Global Terrorism Index, everything we produce on an annual basis. Not only that, but we try to provide interactive maps in which you're able to click on a country and see the breakdown of every domain and indicator for that specific country. A lot of times when I give these presentations, people are always asking, can you send us the PowerPoint? We made it free on our website. So any presentation that you would see from not only myself, but any IEP representative or member, all of our presentations are available on our website on Vision of Humanity. So I'm actually going to end it there. I know I kind of we have more time to discuss. So I'm definitely excited to use the rest of our time for kind of Q&A and talking about all of these points that I presented. So let me pass it back to you, David, first.
Yeah, you have some questions in the chat. I'm just going to go from kind of reverse order on up. And I'm going to pose the question, but since we are a small group, I'll state the question, but then if the questioner wants to elaborate, they can just raise their hand and we'll do it that way. I'll tell them to go ahead. So Carolyn asked, can you expand on what is meant by high levels of human capital? Would the opposite be the latest reports of brain drain we are seeing in Haiti? And I don't know, Carolyn, did you want to elaborate on that, or you can just open your mic? Carolyn? Okay, your mic's not open.
I can go ahead and answer that question.
Yeah,
I wasn't in full screen. I was in a smaller screen, so I had to open it up to get to the mic. Yeah, this is not my area of expertise, so I wasn't familiar with that phrase. And then, this really awful situation that we're seeing in Haiti, just when they were creeping back from that horrendous earthquake. I think it was 10 years ago. Now we have this situation going on. So can you define that term and talk about maybe how that gets cultured, or how it gets expanded or reinforced?
Yeah, so the high levels of human capital indicator, we wanted it to kind of encompass a lot of different themes related to what it means to have human capital, not only levels of education, but also, the access to a healthy life, recognizing that, human capital, having an education or having specific types of resources in order to, have training doesn't look the same for every country. So in terms of indicators, the high levels of human capital domain includes levels of employment, education, or training. So kind of all three. We get those statistics from the International Labor Organization, as well as the number of academics or researchers within a specific country. So we get those statistics from UNESCO. And then lastly, life expectancy, because that kind of encompasses, your ability to have kind of a healthy life. So we kind of group those into that indicator. I'm unfortunately not very attuned to Haiti's positive peace score or kind of the trends in there, but I would probably recommend you to look at the report and see if there are any longer term trends in regards to what's happening with that specific indicator in that country.
Thanks, Carolyn. Michael asked, and then I'll read it, and Michael, if you want to elaborate. So are the positively most peaceful countries coincide with the most harmful to the global environment? Michael, if you want to elaborate that, or maybe restate it, if that's helpful.
Well, I'm not seeing, maybe I'm just not seeing, in the concept of positive peace, much that relates to species extinction, worldwide pollution, resource destruction. It seems like perhaps the very peaceful countries, like the United States, relatively, are also the most destructive of the environment, which in my book would not make them particularly peaceful from a 50,000 foot or any other perspective.
I completely agree, Michael. I would actually point you to a report that we released just last month, kind of in the lead up to COP26. So we released the 2021 Ecological Threat Register, and I'd be happy to share it in the chat. And that is kind of our environmental risk index, so to speak. So very similar to the GPI and PPI, we look at the environmental risk of, I think, more countries than the GPI, so at like 174 countries, ranking their risks to not only natural disasters and temperature anomalies, but also those very much human-related factors that are related to the environment. So food insecurity, water insecurity, population growth as well. And something that I find, very interesting in terms of the way IEP approaches its work is that, every kind of global index that we do is very much related to another. So intuitively, the global peace index and the positive peace index are very intertwined. But the same goes for this new report on environmental risk, the ecological threat register. So we do rank the environmental risk of the countries on the index, but we also overlay it with our positive peace data to look at which countries are, most designed to withstand those environmental risks. In regards to, the point that you kind of made in which, are the most peaceful, quote unquote, peaceful countries, the ones that are most harmful to the environment. This is something that we actually started thinking about when we produced the ecological threat register, because with data, it's really hard to kind of share the whole narrative, especially when you're looking at such a macro level and comparing countries one-on-one to another. We only have data that's been available in the last 20 years. It's really hard to tell the full narrative when it comes to, in my opinion, colonization, imperialism, when, there's so much more to the story. So I guess one kind of thought that I'll share with that is that it is a definitely interesting area of research that I'd be very interested in, not only IEP looking at, but other research institutes looking at. We released a briefing on perceptions of climate change that kind of compares the global north versus global south perspective on how its citizens view climate change, which I think might answer some of maybe your curiosities a little, but I found really quite interesting just in terms of the way, citizenries are responding to this crisis.
I'm seeing some hands going up. Fran, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? Just undo your microphone.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for this very informative presentation you had. I really enjoyed it last year and likewise this year. I think I'd like to continue on with Michael's question, and that would be, a part of the question would be about resiliency, that, how, we view climate change, or how resilient we are about climate change. But that's also, I think, his point about like how destructive, some of us, like, for example, with the environmental justice, how a country is kind of treating people in terms of environmental justice, or injustice of it. So where would that fit in to see the countries that, actively are trying to be better, or the ones that, particularly in terms of environmental justice and racism in there, and connecting those issues and being more destructive and having more destructive policies, how would they fit in the whole scheme of things?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, with this kind of new environmental report, we recognize that, these issues, although, you have to kind of address the natural risks, as IEP, we're kind of interested in the social dynamics behind them. So what we're hoping, what the positive peace index can do by having indicators such as acceptance of the rights of others, high levels of human capital, well-functioning government, and relating them to issues of environmental risk. Ultimately, we really wanted to show how interlinked they are, as you mentioned, these institutions, they matter with issues of environmental justice. They also matter with issues of human rights and racial equity. It's very interlinked. So, really the narrative of what we tried to kind of display at IEP is that these issues are highly correlated with one another. And so, resiliency, not only addresses kind of those social issues, but hopefully through, kind of a report in the ecological threat register can address very much environmental risk as well.
Other questions? Just go ahead and open your microphone, because we're a small group. If you've got another question for Jessica.
Jessica, are you able to like de-aggregate your data so that you can show, say, Puerto Rico separately from the rest of the United States, because their economy is very different and their situation is very different?
Unfortunately, not at the subnational level, just because of the data sets that we use. We do data sets that are available for, every country. That's something that we hope to work on. And that's kind of why we are interested in producing country level reports. So not for the United States. We did produce a United States Peace Index back in 2012. I am of the opinion that it needs an update. But we have one for, say, the Mexico Peace Index, in that we kind of de-aggregate all of the data for the 32 states of Mexico and look at levels of conflict within that certain country.
Michael, you had another question. Or your microphone's open, Michael.
Well, the microphone is open and I always have questions. I didn't have to end up. What would you say to the assertion that I could make, not entirely facetious, but that the United States is exceptionally resilient because we are exceptionally privileged with the largest military on the face of the planet, and we can take whatever we want. Let's look at that concept of resiliency as this sounds like an element of positive peace, right? And where are its roots?
Very loaded question, in which I invite other people to kind of weigh in. But I will note kind of an interesting note about the United States when it comes to the data that we have. So on the Global Peace Index, the United States ranks very poorly. I think it's 122nd out of 163 countries. That is because in terms of the militarization category, of course, we have the largest military budget in the world, and other levels of, access to small arms, levels of homicide, engagement in conflict. So that brings us down. The United States has a positive peace surplus because although their GPI score ranks very low, as you mentioned, our positive peace indexes is very high because as the United States, we have a very strong business sector. So we rank well in the sound business environment. Compared to other countries, we have relatively strong levels of acceptance of the rights of others, very strong high levels of human capital, given the sector of our, the different industries we have in our economy. And what does that mean? When you have a country with very low levels of negative peace, but very high levels of positive peace, what kind of implications does that mean in terms of the way we address shocks like COVID-19 or racial injustice or even environmental issues for that matter? I don't have an answer. I'm just pointing out a very interesting phenomenon that the United States kind of features. Other countries do have a positive peace surplus as well. I just can't remember them off of the top of my head. But just in terms of what the data says, the data does kind of recognize that the United States and its place ranks very interestingly compared to other countries.
I have a question for everyone else, and maybe for the benefit of Jessica, is that somebody from IEP has come almost every year we've done this, and I'm always interested in finding out the lasting impact of IEP coming and talking about their work. So the question I'm turning over to you is, how many of you have integrated some of the work that IEP has done, GPI, whatever, in some of your coursework at one level or another? And just open your mics if you've done something like that. If you've integrated it or shared it with students, or maybe you have an idea of how to integrate it that you haven't done right now. And this might be a good conversation to have. How do we take the data? I mean, one of the challenges in the peace field is that we have not been a metrics and evaluation data-driven field at times. And IEP has been one organization that has kind of raised that bar and said, yes, we can be that way. And we're in a world where what is a fact, right? We don't have to go down that road. But when we have data and we can show something, how do we use that? Thoughts on that?
Jessica, could you tell us a little bit more about, you've developed some quizzes and whatnot? I will definitely tap into that.
Sure, let me see if I can share my screen and show the Positive Peace Academy. But in terms of, with IEP and kind of the structure of our organization, you have one side, which is our research side. I'm not a researcher. All of our research is actually conducted in our headquarters in Sydney. Mostly my domain is kind of my role at IEP is leading our education efforts. So how do we turn this very quantitative, very data-driven research into tools that are accessible to just everyone, not people who kind of speak economics or speak data. So one of the ways we tried to do that was through developing a Positive Peace Academy, in that people can kind of access our research in a very approachable and accessible way. So let me share my screen, kind of walk you through. Okay, are you able to see
I
my
see
screen?
that you're starting to share it. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So this is the Positive Peace Academy. We developed this a couple years ago. And as I mentioned, it is a free online course with 5 different modules. The whole course itself, I would say, takes about 2 hours to complete. And so we have different modules in terms of introducing peace as a concept, and then going into some of our reports that we have. So measuring peace, and then at the end there's a quiz. So we have here module 3 is kind of like an intro to each of our core reports. So we have the Global Peace Index, the Global Terrorism Index. We released a briefing called COVID and Peace, which looked at the impact COVID-19 had on levels of global peacefulness, religions and peace, and then, as I mentioned, the new ecological threat register that we have. And so, yeah, I mean, and just in terms of tools, we use this in our IEP Ambassadors program and a couple other peace education programs that we have with various strategic partners. The feedback that I've gotten is that it's a great tool for students at any level. We worked with students in middle school and high school who have, taken this online course just to kind of understand peacefulness. It could, if I was, I majored in peace and justice studies, but if I was an intro to peace studies student, I would have really appreciated kind of, this is just a new and refreshing way to learn about peace. So we have videos, we have quizzes, and yeah. Stop sharing.
That's great. And Jessica, do you know that there are schools that are, let's think about community colleges. Do you know of any community colleges or four institutions that are using this? Are you keeping track of that somehow?
I wish we could keep track. Ultimately, I know our executive director here in our New York office, Michael Collins, he's presented to this audience before. So he's worked with a couple of community colleges, I think Johnson Community College, on developing some sort of incorporating positive peace in their curriculum.
Johnson County Community College.
Johnson County Community College.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
I know the folks there. Yeah.
At the undergraduate level, our colleagues in Brussels worked with Blanquerna University to create a master's in positive peace. So a lot of the curriculum was kind of driven by some of IEP, and the curriculum was kind of created to involve the research in that master's program as well.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions? Just open your mic if you've got questions or maybe thoughts about how you could use it. We also want to share with amongst each other. Seems like there's been a lot of faculty have been talking, and I know there are some students here also that are intrigued by this. So go ahead and ask a question or make an observation. Just open your mic.
Yes, very much open to feedback. If there is an aspect of the Positive Peace Academy that you think would become more user-friendly, please send it back to me, and I'd love to send it back to our tech team.
Paul Chapman.
Hey, everyone. It's been difficult to get students to use these kind of resources during COVID because so many of our courses have been online and they've had so many other concerns, work, sickness, all kinds of things. So honestly, when we get back to, and we're almost there at my college, but when we get back to face-to-face, this is just an observation, face-to-face courses, that are the majority of our courses being offered rather than online. once we get through all of this, I think these will be much more useful for the students, because I can have them in class face to face and walk them through how to use these things, what kind of a benefit it is to them, how much work has been put into these things for them to benefit from it, that type of stuff. So I can remember using the USIP courses years ago for my intro to peace studies course to try to get students a little more involved in the study of peace, and they did it, right? They did it, but I had face-to-face courses to again be in class with them and talk about these things. So I've tried to use Zoom sessions, get students interested, but honestly, most of them just have too many other concerns at the moment. So I'm hoping that'll all change, because these are wonderful resources. I've already signed up for them, I forget when, but it's been a while, and I've looked through them, as well as there's another one, the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. They have online courses as well, that type of thing. So I really appreciate these. It's just timing right now from my perspective.
I would imagine, it's the 800-pound gorilla that isn't an understatement what COVID has been. And a lot of the things that we would normally naturally engage with our students, because in some respects, in many respects, and maybe in most respects, the study of peace is a humanistic endeavor, and humanistic endeavor depends on interacting with human beings, right? In often the most intimate way. And Zoom is not the most intimate way, but that's what we're to use at this point, right, Paul?
Exactly.
Short
and believe me, they're interested. I don't want to diminish their interest at all. It's just the time that they have to put into extra things on top of what I'm asking them to do in the course. And of course, I can switch that around so that what you've all created is sort of a regular requirement of the course, right, to work through these. So, there's all kinds of ways to handle this. So again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've worked on and what you've put together.
So we have about another minute before we take a break, and then I want to thank Jessica. But any last questions before I want to give everybody we had questions that continue. We could continue them, but I also recognize an hour is about what my seating duration is in Zoom. I have to stand up, though I don't have a standing desk, so I need to use that. But any more questions for Jessica before we thank her and send her off? No.
No.
Raise your hand. Mina, you have a question. Go ahead, Mina.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, so I know we've been talking a lot about peace building sort of at the macro level, and some of the resources are, more geared toward the macro level and your data and all that. But do you have anything in your curriculum, in your resources that deals with peace building sort of at the micro level, at the individual level? Because I find that building peace should be starting with the individual and out. And I've been doing some of that with my students, and I just wondered if you had any additional resources that I could use.
So we do, in the sense that using the positive peace framework, we really enjoy engaging in community level peace projects. So we do have a couple of resources on our website. Just in terms of data, I can't really say much that we have, but we do have an online guide and as to how you can utilize the positive peace framework at a community level project. So kind of walking through like a facilitator's guide in terms of how can we, bring that definition of well-functioning government down to the community level, changing it to the definition of governance for that community. So, I'd be happy to give another kind of presentation on those workshops that we give, but they are all available on our website.
Jessica, if you can put all that information in the chat and your contact. Thanks for the question, Mina. That is really important, because one of the things we recognize about peace is that, at least the way I always kind of conceptualize the students, is that there's the micro, the meso, and the macro, right? And the micro is often this kind of intimate engagement we have, be it as a mediator or somebody's working with refugees. The meso tends to be kind of the collective action way of looking at peace. So Black Lives Matter, social justice movements. And the macro tends to be the 50,000 feet, right? Which often could be kind of the international diplomacy, kind of the big things, the big things that are driving things. And over the years, what I have found is people who work in one sphere don't really know much about the other sphere. It's not what they operate in. So people who do community mediation, if you will, are not people that know much about, international diplomacy, but they all are connected to each other. And how do we make that connection is really important. So thank you, Jessica. Thank you for spending some time with us. If you can put in your contact information and you put in the link, that's really great. So now we're going to come back at 1:15. I'm waiting for Ahmed Shah Karimi, who's going to speak with us, and he will probably join us in a minute. I did confirm with him this morning, and he's zooming in from Berlin. So we'll come back in about 10 minutes, 1:15 Eastern time. So if you want to turn off your mics and turn off and get up and walk around and do whatever, it's pouring where I am. I imagine, Carolyn, where you are, it's probably pouring too, because we're in the same space. I don't know anybody else who's in the Washington area, but we are just getting deluged with rain today. So I'm going to put my raincoat on and walk a little bit for 10 minutes, but I'll stay on for a second. So turn your mics off, get up and walk around, get a little bit of exercise, but come back at 1:15 Eastern time and we'll be back again. And thank you again, Jessica. We really appreciate your being here this morning. So we appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.